Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy, City University of New York. The time now is 6:05 p.m. and our 5-minute grace period has just elapsed. This is Tuesday, September 10th, 2024. And this is our third week of class. And this week, we will begin discussions on how global trade is managed among nations. We will conclude next week with a review of the institutions that have been set up since World War II to manage global trade, their histories, and their different roles. As such, the learning objectives for this module includes the following. Differentiate between different eras in the theory of trade and their underlying themes. And one of the ways that I would differentiate that would be to say that the mercantilist period, the origins of international political economy, are closely associated with the development of modern European states and their global markets. The modern European states gained official recognition at the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia, which marked the defeat of the Catholic Habsburg countries by mostly Protestant countries in Northern Europe. The Peace of Westphalia upheld state sovereignty and territorial integrity by institutionalizing changes to prevent external religious and secular authorities, example the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and other states from interfering in a state's internal affairs. A major factor enabling the state to establish its authority vis-a-vis internal and external forces was the development of mercantilism. Mercantilists were acutely aware of the linkage between politics and economics, viewing both power and wealth as essential to national policy. The mercantilist states could use their wealth, for example, to build up their armed forces, hire mercenaries, and influence their enemies and allies. Thus, they accumulated gold and silver by seeking trade advantages over others in the following ways. They increased their exports and decreased their imports of manufactured goods. They restricted raw materials and technology exports to prevent others from developing manufacturing capabilities and imported raw materials they needed to reduce cost of their own manufacturing. And I'm hoping this last bit of information will be one that would generate a lot of conversation, if not debate, in the next couple of weeks. The paradox of wanting to engage in international trade, but only wanting to export and not wanting to import. And this paradox can be said to inform the modern day World Trade Organization. But we will revisit this issue, I'm sure, in the weeks ahead. But circling back to today's lecture, colonialism was central to mercantilism because the colonies provided the metropole with raw materials and served as markets for its manufacturers. Thus, manufacturing in the colonies was usually prohibited. Even if we were to step back into the modern era and we were to go back as far as the 60s and 70s, we will notice that there are uniformity of goods that countries that seem disparate, that are from different parts of the world, have in common, simply because of the countries they were colonized by. As one example, if you were to go to Nigeria, you would find brands that Jamaicans will find immediately comfortable with. For instance, if you were to talk about Lipton tea, if you were to talk about Tetley tea, as one example, these had to do with markets that the British covered. The same thing is true of French colonies, whether in Africa or in the Pacific. The Industrial Revolution and British hegemony would be the next learning objective. Mercantilism, as the term is used in this class textbook, is a pre-industrial doctrine. The Industrial Revolution, which began in about 1780, affected only some manufacturers and means of production, and initially progressed from region to region rather than involving entire countries. However, Britain became the hegemonic power in the 19th century as it was the first state to industrialize. By 1860, Britain accounted for about 37% of European industrial production, 20% of world industrial production, and 80% of newer technology industries. Britain shifted from mercantilist policies towards free trade. It removed most of its industrial trade restrictions by the 1830s, and in 1846, it repealed Econ laws, which had restricted agricultural imports. So again, this goes back to that paradox that whereas the class goes on, we would see the calculation and the economic evolution in economic thinking that informed Britain's understanding and conclusion that if he wanted to engage in global international commerce, he could not only export and not want to import. The reality of it is that if your trading partner has nothing to sell you, eventually they will run out of money to buy your own stuff. So for you to have customers, they have to have the capacity to purchase. There have to be effective demand. And if you're only exporting and the rest of the world is importing your stuff, but they never get to export to you, they are going to run out of money. And I suspect that's what the economic theory that realization began to emerge when Britain was the hegemonic power. Of course, through history, all good things sometimes come to an end. So the decline of British hegemony and World War I was the next period. The growth of trade became slower in the late 19th century because of depressed economic conditions. Industrial protectionism on the European continent and a decline of British hegemony. Again, industrial protectionism, and we're going to get to that quite a bit in detail. A decrease in Britain's productivity relative to the United States and Germany made it less competitive in trade and less able to serve as a market for other countries' exports. Realize it said that there was a slower growth in the early 19th century. And part of this slower growth could be attributed to decreased demand in Britain and decreased productivity in Britain relative to the United States, which was emerging, and Germany. And here's why that nexus is important. If British economy is productive, that means it is making stuff others want to consume. That means it is selling stuff to other countries and workers are making, employees, labor is making money. When labor is making money, then it can afford to consume imported products from other parts of the world. So you could say that in some sense, Britain was the economic engine of the world. So when productivity relative to the United States and Germany made it less competitive in trade and less able to serve as a market for other countries' exports. So the second thing we want to do this week is to be able to identify and explain the underlying philosophies of different theories of international trade. Theories of international trade tend to explain the nature and movement of international trade. Such theories can be classified into classical country-based theories, mercantilism as an example, absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and Heckler-Ohlin theory. So let us unpack this. Theory of mercantilism. This trade theory prevailed during the 16th to 19th centuries, where the wealth of a nation is measured based on its accumulated wealth in terms of gold and silver. It calls on nations to accumulate wealth by encouraging exports and discouraging imports. Again, I hope the paradox is becoming clear to everyone at this point. The theory of mercantilism aims to create trade surplus, which in turn accumulates a nation's wealth. Absolute advantage theory. This is a critical theory in global trade and economics. The theory of absolute advantage has origin in Adam Smith, an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. It was written in 1776. And it goes something like this. When one country can produce a unit of good with less cost, cheaper and or faster than another country, the first country has an absolute cost advantage in producing that good. Here's that theory again. When one country can produce a unit of good with less cost, that is cheaper and or faster than another country, the first country has an absolute cost advantage in producing that good. Here is why faster means cheaper, holding all factors constant. If you pay your worker $10 an hour to produce a widget, and for those of us who are not in the know, a widget is an economic term that signifies any unit of product, any goods or service produced. Is a synonym for any goods or service. So if you pay your workers $10 an hour to produce a widget, and it takes them an hour to produce that widget, and I pay my worker $20 an hour to produce that same widget, except my worker can produce the widget in 30 minutes. You can see how my cost of production is cheaper than yours simply because it's faster. So in an hour, I would make double the widgets. What if my cost, I could produce say 3 units in an hour or in 30 minutes. So efficiency can lead to cost savings. That is really the moral of the analogy. So next to absolute advantage is a similar but distinct theory called comparative advantage. This has origin in David Ricardo's The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, which was published in 1817. And the theory is really very simple. Nations can still gain from trade even without an absolute advantage. That is, although I cannot make any widget at less cost than a different country, it is possible that I could still engage in international trade and indeed win market share in international trade. Here's how that would work. A country has a comparative advantage in producing a good if the opportunity cost of producing that good is producing that good in terms of other goods is lower than the country compared to other countries. Here's what that means. Let's say the United States can produce flip-flop for $8. And I am country X in Central America, and I can produce the same flip-flops at $10. It may not be worth it for the United States, although it has absolute cost advantage over country X in Central America in producing flip-flops. at $10 per. It may not be working for the United States to invest in manufacturing flip-flops when the United States has Boeing Aerospace Company as an example. The United States has an advantage in car manufacturing with Ford Motor Corporation, General Motors, among others. What will make sense for the United States is to get its labor force in higher wage sectors, such as car manufacturing and aeroplane manufacturing, so they can make more money, and then leave flip-flop production to country X in Central America. Because the opportunity cost, in other words, the next best thing that the United States can do with that pool of available labor and the capital to build a manufacturing plant would be to build a car assembly plant. And that would be a better way to spend money if you are running a municipality in the United States. So to put a bow on it, a country has comparative advantage in producing a good if the opportunity cost of producing that good in terms of other goods is lower in that country compared to other countries. Comparative advantage focuses on the relative productivity differences, whereas absolute advantage looks at the absolute productivity. So there is an opportunity cost to any decisions we make about capital. Capital is always a finite resource. So next we get into endowment theory. The Hesker-Olin model and factors proportions theory. According to this theory, a nation will export the commodity whose production requires intensive use of the nation's relatively abundant and cheap factors and import the commodities whose production require intensive use of the nation's scarce and expensive factors. As one example, if you live in a water-stressed country, you probably don't want to start up a bottling plant and export water overseas because that would be a scarce and expensive resource, right? So it would make sense for countries like that has mountain peaks, snow-peaked mountains, have natural springs, to instead manufacture and export water. Because in this case of the latter example, water is would be a relatively abundant and cheap raw material for production. Thus, a country with an abundance of cheap labor would export labor-intensive products and import capital-intensive goods, and vice versa. On the other hand, modern firm-based theories include country similarity, product life cycle, global strategic rivalry, and Porter's national competitive advantage. Again, let's unpack this. Product life cycle theory. International markets tend to follow a cyclical pattern due to a variety of factors over a period of time, which explains the shifting of markets as well as the location of production. Of note, the level of innovation and technology, resources, size of market, and competitive structure influence trade patterns. In addition, the gap in technology and preference and the ability of the customers in international markets also determine the stage of international product life cycle. Theory of competitive advantage and international trade. As propounded by Michael Porter in The Competitive Advantage of Nations, the theory of competitive advantage concentrates on a firm's home country environment as the main source of competencies and innovations. The model is often referred to as the diamond model, wherein 4 determinants interact with each other And these include factor conditions, demand conditions, related and supporting industries, firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. 3, identify the trend of development in international economic relations up to World War II and beyond. These are called the interwar period. The United States emerged from World War II as the world's largest industrial power and the only major net creditor, although it lent about $10 billion to cash-short countries during the 1920s. Some US policies did not facilitate a return to an open liberal economy, and we will discuss this very quickly. For example, the United States initially insisted that its close allies, Britain and France, repay all their war debts, and it imposed import barriers that made it difficult for Europeans to gain revenue from exports. So it's kind of short-sighted. The United States had a policy of helping its close allies, Britain and France, by extending them debt service. However, it insisted that France and Britain repay its debt to the US Treasury. That's fair. What's challenging about that is if the United States then imposes import barriers as it did, it makes it difficult for the Europeans to sell and trade internationally to make the money to be able to service the debts that it owes the United States and upon which the United States intends to collect. The 1922 Fordney-McCumber Act raised US customs duties. And when the US economy moved into depression after the 1929 stock market crash, the 1913 Smoot-Hawley Act increased US tariffs to their largest levels in the 20th century. European states retaliated with their own import restrictions, and the world trade declined from $35 billion in 1929 to $12 billion in 1933. The critical takeaway here is that trade barriers, is a lose-lose situation. On the other hand, subsidizing export products also distorts the price and demand dynamics of global markets. Again, we will get to this part in the weeks ahead. But for now, recognize what's going on. The world economy is sliding into a depression. And the architect of this depression is the building up of trade barriers and tariffs that makes it difficult for one side of the world to sell goods that it has comparative and absolute advantages to the other side. The next important theory to understand is the hegemonic stability theory, which argues that the lack of a global hegemon prevented the development of an open, stable international economy in the interwar period. That is largely true, but this theory also supposes that simply having a global hegemon will set trade right. It has to be the global hegemon with the right economic philosophy. And that's the addendum that I would put to that. The institutional framework before World War II. Most international organizations formed from 1815 to 1914 were designed to utilize technological innovations and promote economic relations and commerce, mainly among European states. The first financial international organization, the Bank for International Settlement, or BIS, was established in Basel, Switzerland in 1930 to oversee the settlement of German reparations after World War I. But its main purpose was to promote cooperation among central banks. Other than the BIS, which again is the Bank of International Settlement, Economic international organizations in the interwar period were mainly concerned with developing international standards for facilities, equipment, and installations required for the functioning of the global economy. These organizations were not able to deal with major economic problems such as the Great Depression. They just lacked the institutional framework and were not robust enough. Frankly, they were not even conceived to address those kind of challenges. Moving forward, you will also be able to explain the differences in the functions and roles of post-World War II institutions developed to manage international trade relations. So again, we will get to post-World War II. So in July 1944, and this is the post-World War II, as you know, World War II was between 1939 and 1945. So in July 1944, the Allied countries could begin to see the finish line, presumably. Delegates from 44 countries convened the Bretton Woods Conference, and within 22 days, they endorsed a framework for international economic cooperation after World War II. The international economic organizations resulted from the Bretton Woods Conference. First is the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. The IMF is regarded as the global lender of last resort to national governments and a leading supporter of exchange rate stability. And we will get to what all this means in the weeks ahead, I assure you. The stated mission of the IMF is working to foster global monetary cooperation, secure financial stability, facilitate international trade, promote high employment and sustainable economic growth, and reduce poverty around the world. The IMF began with an original goal of reconstructing the international monetary system after World War II. It now plays a central role in the management of balance of payments difficulties and international financial crisis. Through a quota system, countries contribute funds to a pool from which countries can borrow if they experience balance of payment problems. And we will, in the weeks ahead, unpack balance of trade problems. The second is International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which is now part of the World Bank Group. So that is the second organization that came out of the World Bank Group. So the second institution that came out of the Bretton Woods institution is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which is now part of the World Bank Group. And as folks don't often realize, the World Bank Group is not one institution, it's a cluster of institutions. And we will again get to that as we go through this class. The World Bank is an international financial institution that provides loans and grants to governments and private institutions of low and middle income countries for the purposes of pursuing capital projects. The vision of the World Bank is to create a world free of poverty on a livable planet. The World Bank Group is a unique global partnership of 5 institutions working for sustainable solutions that reduce poverty and build shared prosperity in developing countries. So as I said, contrary to what most people think, the World Bank is not one institution. Indeed, its full name is the World Bank Group, and it has 5 individual banks with 5 different mandates within the organization. So the 5 institutions include, again, the first of the 5 banks that was instituted, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Then there is a second, IDA, the International Development Association. The third is IFC, the International Finance Corporation. The fourth is MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. And the fifth institution of the World Bank Group is the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. Partnering with governments, the IBRD and the IDA from the World Bank institutions that provide financing, policy advice, and technical assistance to governments of developing countries. IDA focuses on the world's poorest countries, while IBRD assists middle-income and credit-worthy poorer countries. Partnering with the private sector. IFC and MIGA and ICSID focus on strengthening the private sector in developing countries. So the first two partners with governments, public institutions, and the latter three focuses on strengthening the private sector in developing countries. Through these institutions, the World Bank Group provides financing, technical assistance, political risk insurance, and settlement of disputes to private enterprises, including financial institutions. In 1948, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, i.e. GATT, became the main global trade organization. And this in and of itself is sort of a misnomer. GATT wasn't so much as an organization as an agreement, and we will, in the period ahead, get to understand the distinction. It simply lacked, it wasn't robust enough. It lacked institutional capacity to mediate and facilitate trade in an increasingly complex world. So, but the important thing to understand is that GATT was set up to eliminate protectionism, get countries trading freely among themselves, and help restore economic prosperity following the devastation of World War II. Accordingly, GATT was created to form rules to end or restrict the most costly and undesirable features of the pre-war protectionist period, namely quantitative trade barriers such as trade controls and quotas. GATT also provided a system to arbitrate commercial disputes among nations, and the framework enabled a number of multilateral negotiations for the reduction of tariff barriers. In 1995, GATT was superseded by the World Trade Organization, or WTO. GATT, though largely successful in its goal, lacked a coherent institutional structure, which is what I was speaking to. In short, it was a legal agreement acting as an international organization, which is what I had alluded to earlier. The World Trade Organization incorporates the principles of the GATT and is better positioned to carry them out because, among other things, it is better versed in issues like intellectual property, has faster dispute settlement system, and wields more power. Significantly, though, WTO rules are applicable to service and aspects of intellectual property along with goods. So, unlike GATT, that exclusively focused on trade in goods, WTO is much broader, the World Trade Organization. It also covers trade in services, an aspect of international intellectual property rights. The next critical institution that also came up post-World War II that helped create an international order is the when we say international order or the rules-based international system, it all derives from the United Nations. The United Nations, well, the international order also includes the Bretton Woods Institution, World Bank, IMF, right? But the rules-based international system really derives from the UN Charter. And let's unpack the United Nations a little bit, which is right there in New York next to most of you who are out of New York City. So the United Nations, of course, succeeded the League of Nations, which was established after World War II. And this charter was drafted by 50 countries in San Francisco, California. It took effect on October 24th, 1945, with the aim of preventing future world wars. The UN is an intergovernmental organization whose stated purpose are to maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, achieve international cooperations, and serve as a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. It is the world's largest international organization. So, as I mentioned, each class, and as we move ahead, there are key words and phrases that are critical for you to know, to be able to convey and to signal to whoever you're engaging that you're truly a scholar in international commerce and political economy. You might want to write this down. You might want to go back and rewatch the class video. One of these keywords and phrases is the balance of payments, BOP, also known as the balance of international payments. It is a statement of all transactions made between entities in one country and the rest of the world over a defined period of time, such as a quarter or a year. As you know, for purposes of general commerce, each year is broken down into 4 quarters, Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. So each quarter has 3 months. The two main components of a balance of payment account are current account and capital account. First, current account is a country's current account record that records the value of exports and imports of both goods and services. Capital account is a country's capital account tracks the net balance of international investments. In other words, it keeps track of the flow of money between a nation and its foreign partners. So the reason why balance of trade is critical to understand is that it gives a snapshot of how competitive a country is with respect to being able to export its goods and service. This is important because most countries do not engage in international commerce with their own currency. Indeed, most commodities are traded in US dollar. So by necessity, if country X wants to engage in international commerce, it needs to sell more stuff that it can charge dollars for. When you calculate the value of all the goods and services that country sells to other countries, and you subtract it with the cost of all the goods and services that country imports, it will let you know whether that economy is competitive or not, whether it buys more stuff than it sells. If the country buys more stuff than it sells, it's going to suffer what is known in international commerce as a balance of trade deterioration. Eventually, that country would not have enough money to buy the things that it needs. And that's when countries go to the IMF. And that's why they call IMF a lender of last resort. And this is where the controversy about IMF comes up on whether its lending conditionalities can be harmful to already vulnerable countries and society. But the truth is, before countries go to the IMF, that's the reality, they already have a macroeconomic condition that is unfavorable to especially the most vulnerable in our society. And continue to lend those countries money without reform would just be throwing good money after bad. At least that's what the IMF would say. So as we wind down this week's lecture, I'd like to remind the class that next week, Monday, we will follow up with the second half. Actually, not next week Tuesday in our office hour. We will follow up with the second half of this lecture. With that in mind, let me also foreshadow next week's lecture by confirming that Module 4 will be on major institutions for managing world trade. So there are institutions that create rules, manage conflicts, which is why it's called the rules rules-based international order. And that is important to note. And with that, I would end the formal part of today's lecture. I am glad to take your questions, and I hope everyone got something out of this. And if it's okay, I will also turn off the recording.